in the shadow of Hampton Court Palace, a queen lay fading, just 12 days after giving England the heir it had long prayed for. While church bells rang in triumph for the birth of Prince Edward, Jane Seymour's body gave way to the agony of complications no Tudor physician could remedy. She had achieved what no other wife of Henry VIII had managed. She gave him the son who secured his dynasty, yet her reward was not comfort, nor care, but neglect. As the king reveled in his long-awaited triumph, history remembers Jane Seymour as the wife who succeeded where others failed. But behind that triumph lies a stark reality: she was dispensable. The very moment her duty was fulfilled, her story exposes the merciless arithmetic of Tudor politics, where a woman's worth was measured by her womb, and even queens could be cast aside once their purpose was complete. By 1536, Henry VIII was a monarch consumed by obsession and fury. 2 wives had already paid the price for his desperation. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, was cast off and left to die in lonely exile after years of humiliation. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he had severed England from Rome, lost her head on Tower Green when she, too, failed to produce a son. The royal court had become a hunting ground where powerful families offered their daughters like pawns to feed a king's dynastic hunger. Into this treacherous arena stepped Jane Seymour, a quiet lady-in-waiting whose plain appearance concealed sharp political instincts. Unlike Anne's fiery wit and bold defiance, Jane embodied the Tudor ideal of womanhood, obedient, pious, and modest. Her family, the Seymours of Wiltshire, recognized both the danger and the opportunity. Having witnessed Anne's meteoric rise and catastrophic fall, they understood that survival required not just ambition, but calculated restraint. Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, carefully engineered her ascent. They placed her in Anne Boleyn's household, where she could study the Queen's fatal errors up close. Where Anne had been outspoken, Jane was silent. Where Anne flaunted learning, Jane displayed humility. Where Anne challenged, Jane submitted. This deliberate contrast proved devastatingly effective. The king's pursuit of Jane began even before Anne had fallen, revealing Henry's predatory nature. Coached by her family, Jane played the part of the virtuous maiden, refusing the king's early advances. This only inflamed Henry's desire, while allowing Jane to appear morally superior to the Queen herself. By May 1536, as Anne stood trial on charges of adultery and treason, Jane was already being fitted for royal robes. Anne was executed on May 19th, and just 11 days later, Henry married Jane in a hushed ceremony at Whitehall. The king's grief for his late wife barely lasted a week. His hunger for a new vessel to bear his heir drowned out all other emotions. Yet Jane entered marriage not with triumph, but with trembling hands and pale cheeks, fully aware she was stepping into a role that had already cost 2 women their lives. As Queen Jane performed her role with studied caution, contemporary accounts describe her as suitably quiet, submissive, and devoted to religion and domesticity, words that reveal not her nature, but her survival strategy. She had learned from her predecessors that queens who spoke too much, or stood too tall, did not survive long in Henry's world. When her pregnancy was announced in early 1537, Jane's value transformed overnight. She ceased to be a person and became instead a vessel for England's future. Henry's moods swung between euphoria and dread, and he placed her under suffocating scrutiny. Every step, every meal, every prayer was monitored. Astrologers cast daily charts, priests offered constant blessings, and even Jane's glances were policed, lest superstition declare them dangerous. Her confinement at Hampton Court was both gilded and grim, a palace turned prison. The king prepared both christening robes and funeral shrouds, proof that in Tudor politics, joy and death were planned side by side. On October 9th, 1537, Jane's labor began. What followed was a 3-day ordeal of blood, agony, and desperate prayer. Her cries echoed through the corridors, while Henry paced in anguish. Modern medicine would recognize the complication as a breech birth, but Tudor doctors had only crude tools: herbal brews, hot poultices, and frantic prayers. Priests were summoned repeatedly to deliver last rites as Jane hovered between life and death. Finally, on October 12th, after nearly 3 days of torment, a healthy son was delivered. The baby's first cry was met with jubilation. England had its long-awaited prince. But as the court rejoiced, Jane's body was breaking. The prolonged labor had left her torn and bleeding, and no remedy of the age could save her. Henry, overjoyed at his son's arrival, showed little concern for his wife's worsening state. Once assured of the prince's health, he turned his attention to christening ceremonies and political triumph. Jane, the queen who had given him everything, was already fading into the shadows of his ambition. For a few days she seemed to recover, a cruel illusion that gave hope before despair. But within 12 days of the prince's birth, Jane Seymour was dead, remembered as the consort who gave England its heir, and forgotten as the woman who paid for it with her life. Her story is not one of triumph, but of sacrifice, of how even queens were pawns in the ruthless game of Tudor survival, cherished only until they had served their purpose. Birth, she seemed to rally, sitting up in bed to hold her son, and receiving congratulations from courtiers who praised her for fulfilling her royal duty. Contemporary accounts describe her as weak but alert, expressing joy at having given England its prince, while seemingly unaware that her body was failing internally from complications that would soon prove fatal. The medical understanding of postpartum complications in 1537 was virtually non-existent. What modern medicine would recognize as puerile sepsis, a deadly infection often caused by unsanitary birthing conditions and internal trauma, was dismissed by Tudor physicians as temporary weakness that would resolve with rest and prayer. Jane's rising fever was treated with cooling cloths and herbal remedies, while her increasing delirium was attributed to the natural exhaustion of childbirth rather than the spreading infection that was poisoning her blood. By the 5th day after the birth, Jane's condition had deteriorated alarmingly. She complained of severe abdominal pain and chills, symptoms that sent the royal physicians into panicked consultation. They prescribed increasingly desperate treatments: bloodletting to balance her humors, purgatives to cleanse her system, and exotic medicines imported at enormous expense from continental Europe. Each intervention likely worsened her condition, but the doctors continued their futile efforts, knowing that failure to save the queen could cost them their own lives. Henry's behavior during Jane's illness reveals the callous pragmatism that defined his character. While she lay dying, he busied himself with plans for Edward's christening ceremony, showing more interest in the political spectacle than in his wife's suffering. When courtiers brought him reports of Jane's worsening condition, he reportedly dismissed their concerns, stating that queens have died in childbirth before, and that the prince is what matters now. His emotional detachment was complete. Jane had served her purpose, and her continued existence was irrelevant to his dynastic plans. The queen's final coherent words, recorded by her ladies-in-waiting, were reportedly prayers for her son's future, and requests for Henry's forgiveness for any failures as a wife. Even in her delirium, she continued the performance of submission that had kept her alive for 17 months of marriage. She apologized for dying as if her death were a personal failing, rather than the consequence of primitive medical care and her husband's ruthless ambitions. These final words epitomize the psychological destruction that Tudor court life inflicted on its female victims. Foreign ambassadors reported detailed accounts of Jane's final days to their masters, understanding that the queen's death would have significant political implications. The imperial ambassador wrote that the king shows no great grief at his wife's condition, being wholly occupied with his son's welfare. The French envoy noted that Henry had already begun discussing potential fourth marriages even as Jane lay on her deathbed. demonstrating that her replacement was being planned before her funeral. The palace staff, who witnessed Jane's final agony, described scenes of horrific suffering, largely ignored by the court's male hierarchy. While ladies-in-waiting held vigil beside the dying queen's bed, courtiers celebrated the prince's health in adjacent chambers. The juxtaposition was deliberately symbolic. Feminine suffering was invisible and irrelevant compared to masculine achievement and dynastic success. Jane's screams of pain were drowned out by toasts to Edward's future reign. Religious authorities administered last rites to Jane multiple times as her condition fluctuated between lucidity and delirium. Protestant and Catholic clergy competed to provide spiritual comfort, each faction claiming that their prayers were more likely to secure the Queen's salvation. This religious politicking around Jane's deathbed demonstrated how even her final moments were subordinated to larger theological and political conflicts. Her soul became another battlefield in Henry's war against traditional Catholic authority. On October 24, 1537, Jane Seymour died in the early hours of the morning, just 12 days after giving birth to the son who had cost her everything. Her death came not with the drama that had marked Anne Boleyn's execution, but with the quiet exhaustion of a body destroyed by its biological function. Contemporary accounts describe her final moments as peaceful, but this tranquility masked the violent internal collapse that had been killing her slowly since Edward's birth. She died alone, except for her ladies-in-waiting, while Henry slept in distant chambers, apparently undisturbed by his wife's final struggle. The king's immediate reaction to news of Jane's death was reportedly one of mild annoyance rather than grief. According to witnesses, his first concern was whether the news might affect the prince's health, followed by questions about funeral arrangements and their cost. Henry had learned to compartmentalize his emotions during his previous marital disasters, and Jane's death was processed as another administrative challenge rather than a personal loss. His ability to disconnect from the human consequences of his actions had become complete. Within hours of Jane's death, Henry was already discussing the political implications of his widowhood with his council. The conversation focused not on mourning protocols, but on the timing of potential future marriages and their diplomatic benefits. Jane's body was still warm when courtiers began speculating about which European princess might next occupy the Queen's chambers. This immediate transition from death to remarriage planning reveals the purely transactional nature of royal marriage in the Tudor system. The official court response to Jane's death was carefully managed to minimize any suggestion that the king bore responsibility for her fate. Palace announcements emphasized her successful delivery of a prince and portrayed her death as a noble sacrifice for England's future. No mention was made of the medical negligence, the primitive conditions, or Henry's emotional abandonment during her final days. The narrative was crafted to transform Jane's death from a preventable tragedy into a heroic martyrdom. Foreign diplomats noted the striking contrast between the elaborate celebrations of Edward's birth and the subdued response to Jane's death. While the prince's arrival had been marked by public festivities, cannon fire, and international announcements, his mother's death was treated as a minor court matter, requiring minimal attention. This disparity in treatment demonstrated the relative value placed on producing male heirs versus preserving female lives. The container was disposable once it had delivered its contents. Henry's personal household staff later reported that the king showed no visible signs of mourning in the days following Jane's death. He continued his normal routine of hunting, dining, and conducting business as if nothing had changed. When courtiers attempted to offer condolences, he reportedly brushed them aside and redirected conversations to discussions about the prince's care and education. His emotional detachment was so complete that witnesses wondered if he had truly cared for Jane at all, or if she had always been merely a means to his desired end. The treatment of Jane's personal effects after her death further illustrates her expendable status. While her jewelry and valuable items were immediately catalogued for redistribution, or sale. Her personal letters and private possessions were burned without examination. No effort was made to preserve her memory or document her experiences as queen. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whose dramatic end had generated extensive documentation, Jane's quiet death was met with deliberate erasure, as if acknowledging her sacrifice might complicate the narrative of royal triumph. The speed with which Jane was forgotten by those who had once courted her favor was remarkable, even by Tudor standards. Courtiers, who had spent months flattering the queen and seeking her patronage, immediately redirected their attention to other sources of influence. The ladies-in-waiting who had witnessed her suffering were reassigned to other duties and warned against discussing the queen's final days. Jane's death was treated as an inconvenient interruption in the court's larger business, rather than a human tragedy worthy of extended mourning. In death, Jane Seymour was transformed from a discarded wife into a manufactured saint, her story rewritten to serve Henry's political needs and historical legacy. The king's propagandists worked swiftly to craft a narrative that portrayed Jane as the perfect Tudor queen, modest, faithful, and ultimately self-sacrificing for the good of England. This posthumous mythology obscured the reality of her abandonment and suffering, replacing her authentic experience with a sanitized version that supported royal authority and masculine supremacy. The official court historian's writing, under Henry's direct supervision, emphasized Jane's willing submission to her royal duties and her joy at producing a male heir. They described her death as a noble sacrifice, suggesting that she had gladly given her life to secure England's future through Edward's birth. This narrative conveniently omitted Henry's emotional neglect, the primitive medical care, and the systemic indifference that had actually caused her death. Jane became a martyred Madonna rather than a victim of royal callousness. Protestant reformers, seeking to consolidate their influence over the young prince, promoted Jane as the ideal Christian queen whose sacrifice had delivered England from Catholic darkness. They contrasted her supposed humility and devotion with the alleged pride and corruption of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, creating a theological justification for Henry's marital history. Jane's death was presented as divine approval for the English Reformation, with her son Edward positioned as God's chosen instrument for Protestant triumph. The artistic and literary representations of Jane that emerged after her death bore little resemblance to the frightened woman who had actually occupied the throne. Court painters depicted her as serene and confident, surrounded by symbols of maternal virtue and religious devotion. These portraits, created years after her death, showed none of the fear and exhaustion that contemporary witnesses had described. The visual propaganda transformed Jane from a political victim into an idealized symbol of feminine perfection. Henry's own contribution to Jane's mythologization was particularly cynical. In his later years, he would claim that Jane had been his only true wife, the woman who had loved him purely and given him his greatest gift. This revisionist history ignored his emotional abandonment of her during her final illness and his immediate focus on remarriage after her death. By elevating Jane above his other wives, Henry positioned himself as a devoted husband rather than a serial killer of inconvenient women. The construction of Jane's tomb at Windsor Castle became another opportunity for historical manipulation. The monument, completed years after her death, portrayed her as a queen who had died in glory rather than agony. The inscription praised her for giving England its prince, while making no mention of the medical negligence or royal indifference that had actually killed her. Even in death, Jane's authentic experience was subordinated to the political needs of the Tudor dynasty. International reactions to Jane's manufactured sainthood varied based on diplomatic relationships with England. Spanish and French courts hostile too. Henry's reforms quietly questioned the official narrative while avoiding direct confrontation. German Protestant states seeking English alliance enthusiastically endorsed the mythology of Jane's noble sacrifice. The Queen's death became another piece of evidence in the larger European debate over religious and political authority. her personal tragedy lost in the broader ideological conflicts of the age. The most tragic aspect of Jane's posthumous transformation was how it obscured the systemic problems that had caused her death, by portraying her demise as a noble sacrifice rather than a preventable tragedy. The official narrative discouraged examination of the medical, political, and social factors that had actually killed her. Future queens would face the same dangers, because Jane's authentic experience had been erased in favor of propaganda that served male power while sacrificing female truth. Edward VI's birth, purchased with his mother's life, would prove to be both Henry's greatest triumph and his ultimate failure. The long-awaited prince lived only 15 years, dying childless in 1553 and leaving the Tudor succession in chaos. Jane's sacrifice had produced not a dynasty-securing heir, but a sickly boy whose death would trigger the very succession crisis that Henry had spent his reign trying to prevent. The irony was devastating. The woman who died to give Henry, his male heir, had actually delivered the dynasty's doom rather than its salvation. The young prince's upbringing revealed the psychological consequences of his mother's sacrifice. Edward was raised to understand that his existence had cost a queen's life, a burden that shaped his personality and worldview. Contemporary accounts describe him as unusually serious and guilt-ridden for a child, obsessed with religious devotion, and seemingly unable to form close personal relationships. The knowledge that his birth had killed his mother created a complex of responsibility and isolation that would define his brief reign. Henry's relationship with his son was complicated by Jane's death in ways that the king never acknowledged publicly. While he proclaimed Edward as his greatest achievement, he struggled to look at the boy without remembering the wife who had died to produce him. This emotional conflict manifested in Henry's alternating indulgence and distance toward the prince, creating an unstable parent-child relationship that left Edward psychologically damaged and politically unprepared for his future responsibilities. The medical consequences of Jane's traumatic death extended beyond her immediate demise to affect the prince's health throughout his short life. Modern medical analysis suggests that the complications of Jane's labor may have affected Edward's development, contributing to the respiratory problems and general frailty that would plague him from childhood. The same birthing trauma that killed his mother may have weakened the prince, making Jane's sacrifice doubly futile. She died to produce an heir who was himself too weak to survive and reproduce. The political ramifications of Jane's death became clear during Edward's minority reign. Without a strong queen mother to advocate for him, the young king became a pawn in the power struggles between ambitious nobles who had learned from Henry's example that royal family members were expendable resources. The Seymour brothers, Jane's siblings, attempted to use their nephew's throne to advance their own interests, creating the kind of factional conflict that a living queen mother might have prevented or moderated. Edward's Protestant religious extremism, which would define his reign and contribute to subsequent civil conflicts, can be partially traced to the mythologization of his mother's death. Protestant reformers convinced the young king that his mother had died as a martyr for the Reformed faith, creating a psychological obligation to advance their agenda regardless of political consequences. Jane's manufactured martyrdom thus became a weapon used to manipulate her son into religious policies that would destabilize England after his death. The economic costs of Jane's brief queenship and its aftermath were enormous. The elaborate preparations for Edward's birth, Jane's funeral, the subsequent search for Henry's fourth wife, and the political instability caused by Edward's early death consumed vast resources that weakened the monarchy's financial position. Jane's 17 months as queen had cost England more than many military campaigns, yet produced no lasting dynastic security or political stability. The international implications of Jane's death and Edward's weakness became apparent as European powers recognized that England's succession remained fundamentally unstable, despite producing the male heir that Henry had desperately sought. Jane's sacrifice had not secured the Tudor dynasty's future or England's international position. Foreign courts continued to view English royal marriages as temporary arrangements, understanding that Henry's treatment of his wives had revealed the fundamental instability of his entire system of governance. Jane Seymour's death marked a turning point in Henry VIII's reign, after which his treatment of women became even more callous and calculating. His subsequent marriages to Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr were conducted with the understanding that wives were temporary conveniences to be discarded when they ceased to serve royal purposes. Jane's death had taught Henry that he could literally work his wives to death without facing serious political consequences, a lesson that made his later marriages even more dangerous for the women involved. The systematic erasure of Jane's authentic experience from official history established a pattern that would affect how royal women's stories were told for generations. The honest reports of physicians who had attended her, and the private letters that described her fear and pain, were either destroyed or edited to conform to the official mythology. This deliberate historical manipulation ensured that Jane's real story remained hidden, while the propaganda version became accepted truth. The medical implications of Jane's death were largely ignored by Tudor physicians, who were more concerned with avoiding royal displeasure than with improving obstetric care, the same primitive conditions and dangerous practices that had killed Jane continued to threaten royal and noble women throughout the 16th century. Her death represented a missed opportunity for medical advancement that might have saved countless other mothers, but the political need to portray her demise as noble sacrifice prevented honest examination of its preventable causes. The psychological impact of Jane's death on her surviving family members reveals another dimension of the tragedy. Her brothers Edward and Thomas Seymour were consumed by guilt over their role in placing her in Henry's path, while simultaneously attempting to exploit their connection to the royal family through their nephew Edward. Their eventual executions during Edward's reign can be partially attributed to the trauma and ambition created by Jane's sacrifice, suggesting that her death poisoned multiple generations of the Seymour family. Religious authorities used Jane's death to advance competing theological agendas, with Protestant reformers claiming her as a martyr for their cause, while Catholic sympathizers pointed to her suffering as evidence of divine judgment against Henry's sins. Neither side showed genuine concern for Jane as an individual woman whose life had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. Her death became another weapon in the religious conflicts that would tear England apart for generations. Her personal tragedy subordinated to larger ideological battles. The artistic and cultural representations of Jane that emerged in the centuries following her death continued to obscure her authentic experience in favor of romanticized versions that served contemporary political and social needs. Renaissance paintings, Victorian novels, and modern films have all portrayed her as a willing participant in her own sacrifice, rather than as a victim of systematic oppression. These cultural products have perpetuated the mythology created by Tudor propagandists, ensuring that Jane's real story remains largely unknown to popular audiences. The broader implications of Jane's story extend beyond Tudor history to illuminate ongoing patterns of how women's experiences are documented, remembered, and transmitted to future generations. Her transformation from victim to willing martyr demonstrates how historical narratives are constructed to serve existing power structures rather than to preserve authentic human experiences. Jane's story serves as a case study in how official history is manufactured to support political authority while erasing inconvenient truths about the human costs of that authority. The most disturbing aspect of Jane Seymour's story is not her death itself, but the systematic indifference that surrounded it. In a court where elaborate ceremonies marked every royal milestone, Jane's final agony was met with calculated neglect that reveals the true nature of Tudor power structures. The question that haunts historians is not whether Jane could have been saved, Modern medicine suggests that her puerile sepsis was likely treatable with proper sanitation and antibiotics. But whether anyone in Henry's court actually wanted to save her once she had delivered the prince, evidence suggests that Jane's death was not merely accepted, but potentially welcomed by those who saw her continued existence as politically inconvenient. A living queen mother might have complicated Henry's plans for future marriages or challenged his absolute authority over the prince's upbringing. Her death eliminated these potential problems while providing the additional benefit of creating a martyred saint whose story could be manipulated to serve royal propaganda. The timing of her abandonment, beginning precisely when Edward's health was confirmed, suggests a calculated decision rather than medical inevitability. The international response to Jane's death raises equally troubling questions about the broader acceptance of violence against women in positions of power. Foreign ambassadors reported her suffering and abandonment with clinical detachment, viewing her death as a minor diplomatic development rather than a human rights atrocity. The casual acceptance of her expendability by European courts suggests that Jane's fate was seen as normal and expected rather than shocking or tragic. This international indifference reveals how thoroughly women's lives had been devalued in the political calculations of the age. Perhaps most significantly, Jane's story forces us to confront the possibility that the Tudor dynasty's greatest achievement, the production of a male heir, was purchased through what amounts to judicial murder. The systematic neglect of a dying queen, the immediate planning of her replacement, and the subsequent erasure of her authentic experience all suggest a level of premeditation that transforms her death from tragic accident into calculated execution. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who faced formal charges and a public trial, Jane was condemned by a system that simply allowed her to die when she was no longer useful. The medical evidence surrounding Jane's death raises additional questions about the role of deliberate negligence in her demise. Tudor physicians possessed knowledge of herbal remedies and surgical techniques that might have addressed her complications. Yet the treatments she received seemed designed more to hasten her death than prevent it. The bloodletting purgatory and other interventions that weakened her further were prescribed by doctors who understood their likely effects. Whether this represented incompetence or malice remains an open question that implicates the entire medical establishment in her destruction. The silence of Jane's contemporaries about her treatment raises questions about complicity and coercion within Henry's court. Ladies-in-waiting who witnessed her abandonment, physicians who failed to treat her effectively, and courtiers who immediately began planning Henry's next marriage, all participated in a system that valued dynastic success over human life. Their silence was not merely political prudence, but active participation in a structure that routinely sacrificed women for male ambition. The absence of recorded protests or attempts at intervention suggests either comprehensive intimidation or widespread acceptance of feminine expendability. The transformation of Jane's story into propaganda raises fundamental questions about the nature of historical truth and the construction of official memory. If the authentic experience of a queen could be so thoroughly erased and replaced with manufactured mythology, what other historical narratives have been similarly manipulated? Jane's case demonstrates how official history serves power rather than truth, creating sanitized versions of events that obscure systemic violence and oppression. Her story forces us to question not just what we know about the Tudor court, but how we know it and whose interests that knowledge serves. The broader implications of Jane's death extend to contemporary discussions about reproductive rights, medical autonomy, and the ongoing devaluation of women's lives in political and economic systems. Her story provides a historical precedent for understanding how women's biological functions are exploited for masculine and political purposes, and how their deaths from those functions are then mythologized to obscure the systems that caused them. Jane Seymour died in 1537, but the patterns that killed her continue to operate in different forms throughout the modern world. Jane Seymour's story endures not as the romantic tragedy the Tudor propagandists created, but as a warning about the human cost of unchecked where women die from preventable complications because their lives are valued less than male interests. Jane's story resonates with tragic familiarity. Her death 500 years ago illuminates patterns of systemic negligence and calculated indifference that continue to operate under different names and in different contexts. The methodology of Jane's destruction, the systematic isolation, the reduction to biological function, the emotional abandonment, and the posthumous mythologization provides a template for understanding how power structures eliminate inconvenient individuals while maintaining plausible deniability. Her death was perfect in its execution. It appeared natural, served political purposes, generated useful propaganda, and left no surviving advocates to challenge the official narrative. This combination of efficiency and invisibility makes Jane's murder a masterpiece of political violence. The most chilling aspect of Jane's legacy is how successfully her authentic story was erased from popular memory. Millions of people know her name and associate it with producing Henry's heir, but few understand the reality of her abandonment and suffering. This historical amnesia serves contemporary power structures by obscuring the patterns of violence that created and maintained them. Jane's transformation from victim to willing martyr demonstrates how historical narratives are weaponized to prevent recognition of ongoing systemic oppression. The educational implications of Jane's erased story are profound. Generations of students have learned about Henry VII's quest for a male heir without understanding the human cost of that obsession. Jane is presented as the successful wife who gave Henry what he wanted, rather than as the victim of a system that literally worked women to death. This sanitized version of history prevents students from developing critical thinking about power, structures, gender relations, and the ongoing patterns of exploitation that Jane's story illuminates. The psychological legacy of Jane's death extends beyond her immediate family to affect the broader understanding of maternal sacrifice and feminine duty. The mythology surrounding her willing martyrdom has been used for centuries to justify women's subordination to reproductive roles and to glorify their suffering in service of masculine ambitions. Jane's manufactured sainthood became a model for how women's pain could be transformed into moral virtue, creating expectations that real women should similarly sacrifice themselves without complaint or resistance. The medical profession's failure to learn from Jane's death represents one of history's great missed opportunities for advancing women's health care. Instead of examining the systemic failures that had killed her, physicians focused on avoiding royal displeasure, ensuring that the same dangerous practices continued to threaten other mothers. The prioritization of political considerations over medical truth established patterns of negligence that would persist for generations, with countless women paying the price for the profession's unwillingness to confront uncomfortable realities about their treatment failures. The religious manipulation of Jane's death demonstrates how spiritual authority can be weaponized to justify temporal oppression. By transforming her abandonment into divine will and her suffering into holy sacrifice, religious leaders created theological justifications for the systematic devaluation of women's lives. Jane's death became evidence that God approved of feminine submission and suffering, providing scriptural cover for ongoing patterns of gender-based violence and exploitation. The political lessons of Jane's story extend far beyond Tudor England to illuminate ongoing patterns of how inconvenient individuals are eliminated by systems of power. Her death demonstrates the sophistication of state violence when it operates through systematic neglect rather than overt brutality. The calculated abandonment of a dying queen, followed by the immediate erasure of her authentic experience, provides a masterclass in how authority structures eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability and moral legitimacy. Jane Seymour died alone in a palace filled with people, abandoned by the husband who had promised to cherish and protect her, ignored by the physicians who had sworn to preserve her health, and forgotten by the courtiers who had once competed for her favor. Her death was not a tragic accident, but the predictable result of a system that viewed women as expendable resources to be consumed in service of masculine ambition. The true horror of her story lies not in its medieval setting, but in its contemporary relevance. The patterns that killed Jane Seymour continue to operate today, disguised by different languages and institutions, but fundamentally unchanged in their logic and consequences. In the end, Jane Seymour's greatest legacy is not the sickly prince she died to produce, but the warning her authentic story provides about the human cost of unchecked power and the disposability of those who serve it. Her death stands as an eternal reminder that behind every great man's achievement may lie a woman's sacrifice, and that the price of ignoring these sacrifices is the perpetuation of systems that continue to consume lives in service of ambitions that ultimately prove as mortal as their victims. Jane Seymour was Henry VIII's third wife, the one who gave him his heir. But she was also something more important. She was a human being whose life mattered, whose suffering was real, and whose story demands to be remembered not as propaganda, but as truth.